Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. Thank you for pulling up a chair to join me in talking about Texas history today. And the podcast is going to try something new today. As you may know, last week was our 1-year anniversary. I dropped a little bonus episode on November 2nd to commemorate that milestone. And for the past year, I've worked very hard to bring you journal-level scholarship and back porch storytelling. And I think it's worked out pretty well. But as much fun as I'm having with this podcast and as much work as I'm putting into it, I'm trying not to masquerade as an academic. I do believe that Texas has more than its fair share of amateur historians, but there is a tremendous professional history community in this state. And I wanted to give you a peek behind the curtain and talk to a professional historian about how the pros approach Texas history and create all of the great scholarships, the books, the museums, the films that we all love. So for today's episode, I interviewed professional historian Dr. Jody Edward Ginn. Now, Dr. Ginn got his master's from Texas State University and a PhD from the University of North Texas. Dr. Ginn began his career in law enforcement, of all things, but he went from being an investigator for a Central Texas District Attorney to a professional historian. Dr. Ginn has worked with many great history institutions, including the Bryan Museum, the former Texas Ranger Foundation, the Texas Historical Commission, and many others, while also being published many times on various topics in Texas history. And he is recognized currently as one of the premier Texas Ranger scholars in the United States. And in this interview, you're going to hear about how and why someone goes into the field of professional history, how professionals do their research. We'll even hear a little about some Texas Ranger history and even the first movie made in Texas. Dr. Ginn will inform you how to get involved in the history community and why Texas history is so important. Now, those of you who are longtime listeners will realize that this is the first of hopefully many interviews that I'll be doing as this podcast continues to grow. But I got to tell you, the audio in this episode might sound a little strange in your speakers. I interviewed Dr. Ginn on 2 different occasions, once in Austin in person and once over Skype. So I'll just ask you to be a little patient with the audio production. I'm a historian, not an engineer. But don't worry, you'll be able to hear Dr. Ginn loud and clear. So let's go meet Dr. Jody Edward Ginn and get wise about Texas. Dr. Ginn, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on Wise About Texas. It's great to have you here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Well, tell us, I'm going to jump right into it. Tell us why you love Texas history.
Well, I believe I love Texas history for about the same reason that everybody does, and that's my personal connection to it. My ancestors first came to Texas as citizens of the Republic of Mexico, and during the Texas Revolution served in Wiley Martin's company.
All right. Well, Dr. Ginn, would give us a rundown of what degrees you hold that make you a professional historian.
Well, the graduate work is where I went into history. I had a bachelor's in criminal justice for my law enforcement career, and but my master's is in what's called public history, and that is geared towards projects that bring history to the public, as opposed to a traditional academic who simply teaches in university and publishes academic monographs.
Okay, so you've got your PhD, your master's, and your PhD. Tell us a little bit about what projects you've worked on and what you're currently working on.
Graduate school, I began consulting on a variety of projects. It began with archival research. Of course, as a historian, I naturally developed a lot of experience in my law enforcement career, as we discussed, in records research and archival research. So that's kind of how it started. And that research has been geared towards developing content for historical projects on various media. Many of them were book projects, but then it grew into documentary film, educational series, and museums and that sort of thing as well.
So what sort of museum work have you done?
Well, I've done some discrete exhibits in the past, including I did one for the Alamo back in 2014, the Tejanos at the Alamo, that was a temporary exhibit over what they call the High Holy Days. That's the anniversary of the siege and battle. I did a small exhibit. Originally, my very first exhibit was on my ancestor, the Ranger. That's a traveling exhibit that moved around in it, but has been for some time at the Buckhorn Museum in San Antonio. But then I really catapulted after the PhD. I was hired on by a previous client who I'd done research work for, and that's J.P. Bryan and the new Bryan Museum down in Galveston. And I was their historical consultant that wrote all the text for their exhibits, and then also many of their artifact labels, and also wrote and produced 3 videos for them that play as a part of their exhibits.
Well, you did a heck of a job with the Bryan Museum. That's one of my favorite places. I've mentioned it several times on this podcast, and it's just a spectacular piece of work, and I'm interested to learn what an integral role you played. You mentioned your ancestor, the Ranger, and I want to get to that as a way to discuss how you do your research. But before that, you mentioned earlier movies. Tell us a little bit about the movies that you work on.
Well, that's kind of how I ended up in this career shift. Is I started working on a project to develop a series on the complete history of the Rangers based on Robert M. Utley's 2-volume series. That's the modern general scholarship, the general history of both the first 2 centuries of the Rangers. And that got me in partnership with a company in Austin, a long-standing film company in Austin named Elephant Productions. And it also got me involved with the former Texas Rangers Foundation. And they were developing educational programs for 4th and 7th graders primarily, but also geared in some degree to high school kids. And they wanted a video educational series to do that. So we did the first part of that back in 2009, and it actually involved both history and modern-day Rangers and crime scene investigation techniques and that sort of thing. So it really crossed, again, with both my previous career and my current one, to do the history and then also modern law enforcement techniques. And so after I was hired at the Bryan Museum for the basic script text and so forth, then when they found out about my production background, then they hired my partners and I to do that part as well. And so there's an introductory piece that is Mr. Bryan himself welcoming visitors and kind of talking about his interest and his view, why he collected all those things over the years. And then there is a piece on the 1900 storm, the Galveston 1900 storm, which the building that the museum is housed in survived that storm. It's one of the few that from that time that did. And then the last piece is geared towards kids in the kids area downstairs.
I want to ask you this. Why do you think it's important that we study Texas history and learn about Texas history?
Well, I think it's important because Texas is what's in academia is popularly referred to as a transnational borderlands region, and it is to this day. It's a region of the Western Hemisphere where multiple peoples, multiple cultures, economies, and so forth all come together. And they've come together and they've collaborated, they've cooperated, they've at times conflicted. And it's the center of the development of especially the Western United States and North America generally. And so the significance of what has transpired here to build the economies and cultures and populations of North America is I think is indisputable.
Well, I think those of us that do go back a ways in Texas certainly love the history, but you decided to actually change careers and pursue it as a professional. What made you decide to change your career and go and become a professional historian?
Well, I started out as what you refer to as an avocational historian. I started on a personal project on an ancestor who was a Texas Ranger in the 1930s. And in that process of researching my ancestor, I made connections with individuals who introduced me to the field of history, and so the individuals who introduced me to the field of history through organizations like the Texas State Historical Association, my increasing involvement led me to make that leap. I found that it was possible. It was a field that I had no direct connection to before, and as I made those connections and learned more about it, just decided that it was the path for me. And part of it was luck of the opportunity to be able to do it at the right time.
And as I told the listeners before we started the interview, you were in law enforcement for many years. And what is it about academic history that made it so much more attractive to you than law enforcement?
Well, a lot of people, when they hear that, they say, wow, that's such a leap. But in fact, it's really not. I do things. I was an investigator at the DA's office, the district attorney's office in the end. What I do is now is simply investigating events that happened much longer ago. And I'm not using the same burden of proof. We're not looking at beyond a reasonable doubt, but we certainly are looking at a preponderance of the evidence. I don't like to make historical claims or cast aspersions without sufficient evidence.
Well, it's interesting you talk that way. I think you're doing that on purpose, given my day job as a judge. But let me just ask you directly, what is the burden of proof that you use as a professional historian, and is it different depending on what you're writing or talking about?
Well, the key is how I present it, how I characterize it, and how I claim it. And this is the big thing is, we're not putting anybody in jail here, but I mean, you certainly can sully someone's reputation. And so I'm not going to, as I say, make claims or accusations against someone or a group or individuals without a preponderance of the evidence. If clear and convincing evidence, even, but like I say, characterization also matters. The fact is that full evidence isn't always going to be possible, and I have always practiced, and I encourage my colleagues to practice being able to say we don't know. And there are many events in history where at this current time we don't have the full evidence, but perhaps in the future that evidence will surface and somebody can say something more decisive about an event. But so we have to be willing to say we don't know.
Well, the burdens of proof, the preponderance of the evidence is more likely than not standard is the lowest in the law. Would you say it's the lowest for a historian? You got to have something to go on, and if so, what do you look for? What's enough to go on? What type of stuff that you would find?
Well, every individual historian, there are no, hard and fast laws that can be enforced to require that. So every individual historian has to make that choice for themselves, and some unfortunately are have lower standards than others, in my opinion. I'm looking for as much. It's not just a piece of evidence, but then corroborating evidence. Because we all know that you can always have just one viewpoint, one statement, one word, one person's side of the story, and it can be made to sound very convincing. But if you don't have something to corroborate that or to contradict it, that's what I spent time in my dissertation doing in several cases, is I took the full accounts and claims of the various actors involved in the events that I was studying, and I researched each of them thoroughly and then applied my critique, my judgment based on the evidence. So I presented their arguments, I presented their claims, but then I discussed what evidence. And sometimes that's all it is. It's not necessarily about making the final judgment. I can let the readers do that. I'm happy to let the readers do that. And I think most of my colleagues that are of a similar mindset, that it's not so much about drawing the final conclusion on all of these events, but just presenting what we do know. And as far as judgments, a lot of times it's up to the reader to decide.
Well, I do want to get to your dissertation, because that's sort of the difference between an amateur historian and a professional historian, and everything that you just discussed. An amateur historian wants the story. They want to tell a fun story. A professional historian wants to tell a fun story, maybe, but more importantly wants to present evidence of what happened in the past and maybe how it affects what's happening in the present and perhaps even the future. But before we get to what made you a professional, so to speak, let's talk about those sources where you find that evidence. When you as a professional historian decide on a topic, where do you go? What are the sources that you look to?
Well, there's a very wide range. It begins with just personal resources. My dissertation began as personal research into an ancestor, as I mentioned. And so I started with relatives, and some of them, including one key individual's daughter, had a scrapbook which contained photos and newspaper articles from the time, and other documents, even official documents like his Texas Ranger identification, which was at the time known as a warrant of authority. And so you kind of start. You can start anywhere. But that's a key place. Is there are a lot of documents that are still in private hands, and if they don't get thrown away, which many sadly do, then they can be an invaluable resource. And some of these items I was not able to duplicate anywhere else in my over 15 years of research that followed. From there, I started going to the more official, the more well-known places. The archives, the Texas State Archives, was the primary. That's where I found the most. Not only general data about and documents from the period about rangers, such as the records of warrants of authority and lists of rangers who served at the time and that sort of thing that verified who was who and who was actually, involved at any given period, because there was a lot of change at that point. But also court records. The Texas State Archives has all of the courts of appeals records going back to the Republic. And I found in this particular case 5 complete trial transcripts that were appealed to the Court of Criminal Appeals. They involved some, really unique and unexpected events. In the case, 3 of these cases were cases. Now, this is set in 1935 in San Augustine, Texas, what we consider deep East Texas, behind the Pine Curtain, if you've ever heard that term. And these cases were all white juries. This is the height of Jim Crow. And all white juries convicted white men solely on the testimony of black victims and witnesses who did not have to be allowed at that time legally to even testify.
Jody, I'm going to jump in. You've now teased the listeners mercilessly. You've used terms like Texas Rangers, and you've gotten into some exciting testimony, so we can't leave them hanging. Why don't you tell us what your dissertation was? It turned out that what made you a professional was also the same project that got you involved in Texas history and caused a career change. So tell us about this ancestor that had such a powerful effect on the direction of your life, and then we're going to go right back behind the Pine Curtain to those court cases. Who was it?
Well, his name was Dan Hines, and he was my great-grandmother's brother. Now, my great-grandmother lived to be 96 years old, and she passed away when I was almost 21. And so I grew up hearing anecdotes of his service, but all I could recall by the time I started this research was that he had gone into a town in East Texas and quote, cleaned it up, and he was given a pair of pistols as a reward for his service there.
Always a good gift.
Oh yeah, state-of-the-art 357 Magnums.
So what was sort of the arc of his career?
Dan was a cowboy at heart. He was breaking horses for pay by the time he was 12. By the time he was in his 20s, he was managing the Bassett Blakely Ranch, land that is now part of the Cinco Ranch development over in Fort Bend County. That was I forget the exact size. It was several thousand acres, and it had a extensive herd of longhorns, one of the last of that time of that size. And so in the 1920s, as the foreman on that ranch, he was in the movie, the first movie ever made in Texas, called North of 36, based on the Emerson Howe epic.
What year was that?
1924. Ernest Torrance, Noah Beery, these kind of folks were in there, and he was both a technical advisor and then because these cowboys had to be actually there to run that herd, you couldn't have actors doing it, right. And so he's in the movie as well, though he's of course not credited. The credits were they didn't credit near as many people as they do now. So he but like a lot of cowboys, when the Depression hit, he turned to law enforcement as a way to make an income. And I believe the connection was actually through my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother's husband, who was a deputy sheriff in Harris County at the time. and for the rest of his career until the 60s when he passed. And so Dan initially worked as what's called a special ranger. That is not a Texas Ranger, though it's commonly linked because of the similar terminology, but it's a separate thing. And these folks were typically working for railroads or oil companies or the Cattle Association, that sort of thing. And so he started out, and he was doing undercover work under the authority of the famous Ranger Captain Frank Hamer and the Adjutant General William Warren Sterling.
And so then he ended up in East Texas as a Texas Ranger.
He did. He was sent out to do undercover work in the oil fields, and he was working with a fella named Ed Clark, who was an assistant attorney general under James V. Allred. And when James V. Allred became governor, he made Hines a regular Texas Ranger.
And so back to the sources that you were using to write about Ranger Hines, you were going to trial transcripts that revealed some fascinating societal relationships. So go back and tell us more about that.
Right. So, in current day historiography, in among professionals, there's been a consensus for a while that Rangers during this time period of the late 19th, early 20th century, more often than not, were mistreating, if not outright victimizing, minorities rather than protecting them. But a lot of my research is revealing quite the opposite. Now, it depends on which ranger at which given time. And as Robert M. Utley said in Lone Star Lawman and Lone Star Justice, the quality of the captain determined the quality of the ranger, determined the quality of the work that was done, and that sort of thing. And I found this very much to be backed by the evidence the further I go into this. So in San Augustine, and there are people alive today that were young adults and can attest to this and do state that the Rangers under James Allred, including Dan Hines, came in there and they protected the rights and provided an opportunity to seek justice through the court system for these African American citizens, as said before, in the height of Jim Crow. And those cases were heard. Juries convicted, and the Court of Criminal Appeals upheld those convictions.
And so court records often play an important role in telling the story of a society, which is why one of the things that got me so passionate about Texas history was being a judge and trying to preserve some of the historic court records of the Republic in Harris County. And we found fascinating stories, including at the height of slavery in Texas, a slave that sued and won her freedom in a similar situation with an all-white male property-owning jury. So there tend to be lots of myths and modern stereotypes about what actually happened back then, which is, I guess, what motivates a professional like yourself to go back and dig through those sources.
Absolutely. I mean, skepticism is at the heart of it all. We're seeking out, what we think we know about the past a true and accurate and full picture.
So tell us what other kinds of sources that you would look at to, and we'll go back and use your dissertation. What other sorts of sources did you use for that?
Well, newspaper articles very often. It depends on the type of event and circumstances and individuals you're dealing with. And in my case, these were events that were heavily covered, especially on the back end in the press. Both local in San Augustine, but also in Houston and Dallas, even Austin, and some surrounding areas. Again, through another individual, I got a hold of a small cache of newspaper articles from even into Western Louisiana about some of these events that Hines was involved in. Again, that I've not been able to find duplicate anywhere.
We'll throw a bone to the amateur historians because I'm one, and then I'm going to ask you the ultimate question. But tell an amateur historian listening who wants to start researching, what are the top 3 to 5 things to do tomorrow to go look up their ancestor or a historical event? Well,
the very first thing is to seek out existing secondary sources. That's publications, especially books, but not just books. I mean, you could be articles, journal articles. As a professional, we prefer more professional publications that have been peer reviewed, but that you can learn a little bit from anywhere, and it's again about corroborating whatever you do find. But the key is to familiarize yourself with the existing scholarship. What do we already know? And that's where you need to start. From there, you can build on. In fact, it makes your job a lot easier because a lot of people that are not professional historians presumably don't pay a lot of attention to the footnotes. It's often said, it's said among historians that it's that only our colleagues that are critiquing us are going to be paying any attention to our footnotes. But if you're an avocational historian, you should definitely be looking at those footnotes because that can point you in the direction of potential resources. Because And don't assume that because something about that topic has been published already, that doesn't mean, they pulled exactly what was related to their particular thesis or their story that they were dealing with. They would have looked through countless pages of materials that could hold all kinds of gold mines historically that might relate to what you're looking at.
Has you used a term I want you to define for the listeners, historiography. What does that mean?
That is the existing scholarship. That is historiography is publications on a historical topic. For me, there was almost no historiography on St. Augustine, minus one book from the mid-'90s by a late scholar, which was built only on a few oral histories.
All right, well, I talked about the ultimate question. Here it is. As a professional historian, what do professional historians think of avocational historians, and how do the two intersect? Reveal those secrets for us.
Well, it really depends. There's a breadth of opinion on that matter. There are some professional historians who will tell you, look, I'm not interested in the public. I'm not interested in avocational historians. I research and I write to, a half a dozen or more people in my field, around the country or around the world, and that's it. And those people don't tend to have a lot of regard for avocational historians. But there are plenty who do, and their main concern is that, that avocational historians get to know and understand some basics about historical research and writing. You don't necessarily have to do it through a formal education, but if you've got to be a little bit of an autodidact and learn, make the effort to learn yourself. I started, as I said, as an avocational historian, and I got to the point where I realized that if I want to really do this well and make a career of it, then I want to get that training, and again, through luck of certain circumstances, was able to make that happen, and so here I am.
Do you think Texas has more avocational historians than other places? It seems that more Texans are interested in their history than maybe other people in other locations. What do you think about that?
Well, that question is the perfect example of the difference between many professional versus avocational historians, is that most professional historians want to avoid claims of more or most or best or greatest or what have you, or worst or least or any of those sort of things, because they can be very difficult to prove. And so I would say that it's a fair guess that Texas, given the intrigue that surrounding its history, given the level of interest, given the size of the population in comparison to most states, that there probably are. And I think the reason is that, the reason that Texas history is popular is because people care about it. I think a lot of people in a lot of states, they just don't have the same level of interest in their state history.
Well, I agree with everything you said, but you spoke it like a true academic. So as an avocational historian who is shamelessly biased in favor of Texas, I'm going to say we have more, and maybe even most. But that was great. Let's segue into a little bit about Texas pride, which I exhibited shamelessly just then. I mean, as I said in one of my earlier episodes, this show is wise about Texas and no other place. So what is it about this Texas pride that us Texans feel, and how did it develop through Texas history?
That's the tough one. I mean, I think for every individual, it's going to be, it may have a different story, may have a different reason why they feel that pride. The whole concept of the pride comes through the issue of identity. I mean, people identify with their states, and Texans identify with the state, with their home state or their adopted state. In the case of the many immigrants, both nationally and internationally, that have always come here, it's just, that's what makes it unique, is the way the people who live here identify with the state and the region.
Well, you've used the word identity, and I do want to talk about your latest project, because I think it's a great, very timely, and it's discussion of professional Texas history and how it relates to all of us as Texans. And I'll just introduce it. It's a book called Texan Identities, Moving Beyond Myth, Memory, and Fallacy in Texas History. So I want you to tell us about this project.
Yeah, this book was published recently by the University of North Texas Press, and the editors are Dr. Light Cummins of Austin College, also past state historian of Texas, and Dr. Mary Shear of the Lamar University. She's the department chair there. And it started, the subject came after the basic, the basic concept for this book first was to produce a work written by having all the contributors. This is an anthology, so there's several different chapters, and every chapter is written by a different contributor. The editors themselves each contributed a chapter, as well as having written the introduction, but then all the subsequent chapters are written by other scholars. And the connection is each of those scholars were individuals who earned a Master of Arts in History from Texas State University, most of us when it was still called Southwest Texas State University.
Alma mater of Lyndon Baines Johnson, as I recall.
Exactly. And then but these individuals also went on to get a PhD elsewhere, because Texas State to this day does not have a PhD program in history, only the master's program. And so all the contributors in this book have that Texas State master's, but went on to get the PhD, and I actually was the most junior of that group. When it started, I was still ABD, all but dissertation, and finished my dissertation in late 2014.
So this is a collection of essentially essays by very well-known and accomplished historians, yourself included. And what is the title is Texan Identities. Tell us about the title. What does it mean?
Anthologies typically are created to initiate discussion on historical topics. And so they want to offer a variety of perspectives and related topics. So mine is about Texas Rangers in myth and memory, but the others vary widely. There's The Alamo by Dr. Stephen Hardin, but there's also ones about school integration. There's ones about German Jewish Texans and so on. And so, but the common theme is the discussion of how has the Texan identity developed, and how has it been influenced by myth and collective memory, as we call it. That is what the public believes about our history.
All right, well, you use the word myth, and that, of course, raises all sorts of red flags in some people's mind. Tell us what myth means in the context of Texan identities.
Well, myth means that it's either not true or it's at least not proven, such as Dr. Hardin's discussion of the famous line in the sand by Travis at the Alamo. To sum it up, there is no corroborating evidence that ever took place.
And is it one of those things that, and I think I've probably used this line in several of the episodes of Wise About Texas, it may not have happened, but it should have?
Right.
So a discussion then of significant factors in Texas history that shape what it means to be Texan. Does that about sum it up?
Absolutely.
All right, well, your ancestor was a ranger, and we talked about Ranger Hines. Now let's talk about the chapter you wrote in this book and how the Texas Rangers, both myth and memory, shape the identity of Texans.
Well, Texas Rangers over time have come to be seen as really the quintessential pioneer patriot archetype. Rangers are seen as in much of the collective memory as really one of two. There's really two perspectives. They're either seen as the heroes who always get their man, who and are always on the side of justice. But then there's an opposing view that sees them as nothing more as the strong arm of the establishment. And neither view is really premised in actual historical evidence. As I mentioned earlier, the quality of Ranger depended largely on the quality of the commander, which depended on the quality of the person appointing that commander, and that varied. Who had to appoint those commanders and how that came about evolved over time. And some of the biggest periods of critique of Ranger actions happened at a time when they were being highly politicized by governors who had direct power to appoint not only the captains, but they would appoint the rank and file Rangers, and even give out those special Ranger commissions I mentioned earlier, upwards into the thousands to people not only not qualified to be in law enforcement, but actual with criminal backgrounds. And some of the bad actors in the San Augustine events were carrying that sort of special Ranger commission.
So as with probably any organization, it's never all good or all bad, and they evolve. There are good periods,
absolutely,
and there are bad periods. And the Texas Rangers, heroes that they are to all of us Texans, are no different. They're susceptible to the same thing.
Absolutely, and I think that people who see them as heroes, have a fair point in saying that while yes, not all of them have lived up to the ideal, but that shouldn't take away from those who did.
And I found it interesting. I read your essay, and I found it interesting that you gave very fair treatment to the other view, the view that was critical of the Rangers. That isn't 100% accurate either.
No, absolutely not. And again, no group is immune to myths, and I as a former investigator, my approach, as I mentioned, is, I want to see the evidence, and the evidence simply does not support historically, generally, in my experience with all of the areas that I've researched and that I've studied, sweeping indictments of large groups simply don't hold up to historical scrutiny. And that whether that's Texas Rangers, whether that's an ethnic minority, sweeping indictments simply don't hold up, as neither does sweeping adulation.
Was there anything before you started on the project on your Ranger ancestor, was there anything as a young man that sort of made you fall in love with Texas? Maybe a movie or a book or a memory, something like that?
I think I was like any kid. I was intrigued by Texas history. My first, one of my instructors was not particularly good. Sometimes in public schools, you get teachers who don't really have any background in Texas history. It's mixed into a social studies curriculum and so forth, and so if you happen to get fortunate enough to get a teacher who had a passion for Texas history, then they would have passed that on to you, and if not, then it kind of depends. But I was always connected in fact, a few years ago, when going through some old boxes, I found my 4th grade Texas history pamphlets magazine that I had put together, and so forth, and so that's my first Texas history publication.
Well, that's a pretty good start. I don't think, it took me 40 plus years to get to the podcasting moment. So I'd say you had a great head start.
So it grabbed me, but my interest in history was actually stoked by broader works that weren't straight history. They were historical fiction. And as I'm really not a fan of that today as a professional historian because of the liberties that it can take, at the same time, it did. I was an avid reader of James Michener from an early age, passed down by my father and grandfather, who were reading these books, and also some series, the Wagons West series, which had, I forget how many volumes. I read them in paperback, again, passed down from my father to me, and then also a series called the White Indian series. And again, you're talking about dealing with the development in both cases of these series. You're talking at different periods, but you're talking about the development of what became the United States of America, and so and Texas is central to that. It is a transnational borderlands, and it is today, and so in its place, it's a text by Frank de la Teja and some other scholars, called it a crossroads of North America, and so it is certainly its significance can't be overvalued to the development of North America as a whole.
Yeah, and that's always been fascinating to me. One of the things that I've always admired about Texas is we experienced, and when I say we, I'm going back to the 1820s, we experienced real diversity, where the strength of a first a nation, then a state, was formed with diverse peoples all working together. Too often these days, we try to split everybody up into groups and pit them against each other. But back in the earliest days of Texas, you had certainly Mexicans, Tejanos, people of Hispanic descent that were born and lived in Texas, Germans, Czechs, everybody. And in your professional opinion, has that pervaded to the present day?
Well, I think what's important to understand and is that for a long time the contributions, the development of Texas, the early historiography focused on the Anglos that were present, starting with those that came with Stephen F. Austin. That tends to be one of the most significant criticisms of professional historians of both the old historiography and some presented by avocational historians is disregarding the contributions of other groups and other individuals that belonged to other groups other than Anglos. And while there certainly are people who modern day groups for various, with various motivations, seize on that and kind of take it in various directions, based on their own agendas. The key is that these people were here and they were contributing and have continued to contribute to the development of modern Texas. And so it's not about taking away from the Anglo, participants and even heroes that we're used to. It's about sharing the limelight, if you will, with others who were also equally involved.
Well, I think that's so key, because I can tell you as a typical Texan, maybe I'm not typical, but Texans today who were born and raised have experienced in their lives the cultures of all sorts of ethnic groups. I mean, I've eaten tamales at Christmas my whole life. Well, that didn't come from my German ancestors, and we get kolaches for breakfast thanks to the Czechs. So I think that we benefit from all those cultures, and I think to the extent there were gaps in the historiography, I'm afraid we might have lost a lot of the rich fabric of Texas history. And I hope, I know that modern day perspectives hopefully can go back and reweave some of that.
And that's what, as professional historians, what we're trying to do is fill in those gaps and making sure that all of all those who contributed are recognized, so that our children, our grandchildren, our great-great-great-grandchildren will benefit from that knowledge and understand that that Texas was not born of culture conflict, which has long been a paradigm, but which professional historians have long rejected. Whether you side with the Anglos or you side with non-Anglos, whether it be American Indian groups in Texas, or it be Tejanos, Latino Texans, it doesn't matter. That the old notions that culture conflict was at the core of that history has been rejected by most modern historians, and the fact is that it was collaboration and cooperation that has built Texas and continues to.
Yeah, one of the quotes I love from Texan Identities from Kay Goldman, who was writing about Jewish Texans embracing their German roots, and she said, one of the title of the essay was on Becoming Texans. She said, they, meaning the Jewish German immigrants, they could be culturally German, religiously Jewish, and politically Texan. So that struck me as sort of an all are welcome here. And Texas has always been a place where it really didn't matter where you came from. It matters what you do when you get here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can find examples among the Tejanos are the same. You know, when I was studying at Texas State under Frank de la Teja, I actually crunched the numbers on the participants in the Texas Revolution. And while a lot of early historiography kind of dismisses Tejano participation because the raw numbers seem low in comparison to that of Anglos, you've got to take into account that there were over 30,000 Anglos total present at that time in Texas, while there were only about 3,000. Their population had never been huge, and had been decimated during the War for Mexican Independence. And so when I crunched the numbers and looked at them as a percentage of those populations, it's actually a slightly higher percentage of Tejanos participated in combat in the Texas Revolutions than that of the Anglo community. And when you take out the Anglos who had showed up within the last year who were not long-standing colonists, that number grows, that difference grows in the Tejanos' favor.
And that's one more example of why it's important that we do have professional historians that are going behind the stories and weaving the fabric of our culture. Describe for us, as a professional historian, describe the history community. How do professional historians gather? What clubs do they join? Are there opportunities for avocational historians or just people that are interested to join the professionals and learn from them? Tell us about that.
Absolutely. In fact, that's exactly how I came and crossed that line from avocational to professional, is by getting involved in those organizations. But it's not required, and there are a great many. And the number one, the biggest central organization for Texas history is the Texas State Historical Association. I came into contact with them by accident until I started doing research and crossed paths with some of their materials at the what is now the Briscoe Center for American History, and they were at the time housed in the same building. I had never even heard of them because of not being connected to the field. I found out about them, found out about their fellowship programs that's funding to support research, and on a lark applied for some and was awarded a fellowship 2 years in a row. And so because of that, I became involved with the organization, and I found that it was very much a mix of professional historians, but also avocational, and also just people who were, history enthusiasts, if you will, who wanted to learn, who wanted to know what was out there. And they have, they have book dealers, both new books and used and older books, collectors. It's just a wide range. And so the membership is everything from professional historians to businessmen to just, from every walk of life, from every, profession and so forth. There are people that attend and get involved at different levels, and they have resources. They have the Handbook of Texas, which is now the Handbook of Texas is online. They digitized it a number of years ago. That was a big part of their project, but the handbook itself dates back to the mid-20th century when it was first published. And this is information that now, anytime something related to Texas comes up, you'll read articles from across the country where that's where they'll have done. They'll cite, they'll reference the Handbook of Texas. And all that is sponsored and supported by the Texas State Historical Association.
Are there, and you'll even see the occasional podcaster there at those conventions too, I would imagine. Are there any other clubs or organizations that you would encourage enthusiastic amateur historians to join?
Absolutely. In Texas alone, you have not only the TSHA, but then you have the West Texas Historical Association, and you have the East Texas Historical Association. I was just at their conference a few weeks ago. All of these is kind of obvious what their areas of emphasis are. But yes, you have East Texas, you have West Texas, you have even now there's a brand new Central Texas Historical Association. It's sponsored out of Blinn College, led by a colleague of mine, Ken Howell. So these are all great groups. And then if you have a specialty, or if you're interested in museums, there's the Texas Association of Museums, and there's Association of State and Local History, and And so it kind of depends on what your particular interest is, but I would highly recommend that any person interested in history consider, seeking out and attending any of these groups that are of interest to them.
Well, Dr. Ginn, give us a little preview of what's on your current plate. What are you working on?
Okay. Well, of course, the Texan Identities book just recently came out, and we're promoting that currently. I have a chapter coming out in the spring with Ken Howell, who I mentioned. It's an anthology on the Republic of Texas period, and I have a chapter in that book, and that's with a lot of scholars. It's a big book, 500 some odd pages, and I think 13, 14 chapters. It's going to be a very large book, especially in this day and age. Then I have a book I co-authored on the Palmito Ranch battlefield in near Brownsville. I did that on contract with the Texas Historical Commission. William McWhorter, that was my co-author there. He was their military sites coordinator. He's now the director of their Holocaust program. Then I'm under contract in designing and developing the exhibits for the Texas Rangers Heritage Center, which will be built in Fredericksburg, which is sponsored by the former Texas Rangers Foundation.
Well, you've got a lot on your plate. You're obviously very busy, and I want to thank you personally for coming on Wise About Texas. This has been a new adventure for the podcast as we've grown. I thought it was important to bring a professional historian on the show, and I really appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Well, I really appreciate you having me. It's been a joy.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you again soon, Dr. Ginn. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Judge Wise.
Well, I hope you learned a lot from Dr. Jody Ginn. It's fascinating to learn how the pros help preserve and promote Texas history. So let's help them out. Go get involved in some of the associations, do some research on what interests you, and get involved with the great history of this state. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Send me some feedback on who you'd like to hear me interview and topics you'd like me to cover on the show. Don't forget to like and share the Wise About Texas Facebook page and follow the show on Twitter at Wise About Texas and the same on Instagram. I want to thank all the patrons of the show. If you'd like to support the show financially, go to patreon.com. That's www.patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. And throw a little support behind the preservation and promotion of Texas history. Well, thanks for listening. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.